for a 60-year day run, the Toyota Land Cruiser has been Toyota's legendary nameplate that's stuck in the SUV markets today. And for what I can obviously remember is that one of the most recognizable machines made as a Land Cruiser was definitely not what most people obviously understand. In fact, one of the legendary Land Cruisers ever seen today was likely the Colorado, or particularly referenced as the Toyota Land Cruiser Series 90, or J90 for short. The Toyota Land Cruiser Series 90, also known as the Land Cruiser Colorado in some places, is practically made in late 1996 as the FJ70 series model. When the FJ70 series was discontinued for a short while in 2016 and brought it back in 2023, some people may not understand why. Was there actually a mid-sized version of this SUV that did exist before? Well, it did. It was the Land Cruiser Colorado, aka the Series 90. So let's talk about Land Cruiser Series 90. The Land Cruiser Series 90, also known as the Toyota Colorado, or at Asia they call it the Land Cruiser Series 90 Prado. If you don't know what the word Colorado in Portugal means, it means meadow. In fact, it's quite obvious really. The Land Cruiser Colorado was destined to compete with other known mid-sized SUV brands like the Isuzu Trooper, the Mitsubishi Shogun, or the Montero or Pajero in our country here in the Philippines. The Toyota Land Cruiser Colorado was a mid-sized Land Cruiser model built on the body frame of the J70 series Land Cruiser. Among the amenities of the Land Cruiser Series 70, the Land Cruiser Series 90 featured larger wheels and basically a bigger engine, a 3.6 liter 1FZE V6 power plant making 180 horsepower at the crank. Although this likely was a gas guzzler for its time as a 1997 vehicle, the Land Cruiser Colorado actually started off as a 70 series wagon or two-door troop type vehicle in 1984, the same year that the 70 series took off. Well, actually, the 70 series is the one that gave the impression for the Land Cruiser Colorado later on in 1997. What I obviously get about the Land Cruiser Series 90 is that the Land Cruiser Series 90 was likely the most subtle version of the Land Cruisers, unlike its larger heavy-duty counterparts. The Land Cruiser Series 90 featured automatic and manual transmission depending on the options you would go for. There were also different trim levels. There was the GX and VX. Actually, the one that was shipped to the Philippines is the VX trim level with the 3.4 liter V6 gasoline power plant. That power plant was likely bone stock. I mean, who the hell learned how to drive something like that? I mean, obviously I did. I owned one since 2020 and until 2023, so it was basically 4 years ago, and I sold it because it was likely the very first Land Cruiser vintage retro model that I received before my 80 series Land Cruiser. So what did I do with it? Well, nothing much. I just drove it for a couple of times and then we sold it to another owner. And likely, if you date 1997 towards 2020, that would likely it would be 27 years old, which I kind of trust Land Cruisers because they were quite reliable and versatile for their time. The Land Cruiser Series 90 was definitely one of the most indisputable vehicles that I ever found in my life. No pun intended. this vehicle was likely the greatest model ever produced. The Toyota Land Cruiser Colorado, or the Series 90, was the very least Land Cruiser to be the latest model to use a solid front rear axle. What is a solid in front rear axle? Well, the solid front and rear axle are basically a independent suspension that makes heavy duty vehicles travel on rough terrain without shaking the body frame. However, if you drive a solid steel spring on a paved road, that means you would likely cause motion friction. So, to solve this problem, Toyota decided to put leaf springs in the Land Cruiser to make them more durable and more softer on paved roads. So basically, if you combo both leaf spring and independent suspension, then you'd get a smoother and safer ride. Less reduction noise, but the sound of the Land Cruiser Series 90 startup was actually quite loud. It's not actually like a V8 loud or a V12 loud. It was more likely an old V6 because it was likely the first thing that come up to my mind, as it was the very V6 that started off in the 1990s. Although it was likely a 27-year-old vehicle, I don't blame anybody for owning a 27-year-old Colorado Series 90. I actually enjoy the Land Cruiser Series 90 when I was about 14 years old. And likely I was basically into cars during 2020 towards 2022, and I started making vlogs about cars. And what I obviously understand about how the cars were and how they were featured is like they were not just built as machines, they were built as something far more unique. They became a story themselves. They don't just carry or haul people around, carry groceries, do hard work. They basically tell the story between man and machine, a story that goes way beyond human minds and other kinds of knowledge many people believe in. I became a car enthusiast since 2020, so the reason why I started this channel is because I was so dug into cars. I just realized cars were the passion that many people fall in love with when they thought of something old as this. The Land Cruiser Series 90 was the very first iteration of what a Land Cruiser legacy has brought up for almost 65 years. Imagine that. If you were likely the same age as me, from let's just say 14 to 17 years, it would likely give you a fact that the Land Cruiser was definitely something you would notably understand. So the Land Cruiser 90 was basically the best kind of Land Cruiser you would get for a $35 or $40 budget, because it's pretty much cheap. Because buying a Toyota Land Cruiser from 1997 in 2020 that is at least 27 years old would likely be, oh, that's a budget Land Cruiser and I want one. So I did own one for a few years, but then I sold it. So I actually enjoyed the Land Cruiser Series 90 more than modern day Toyota Land Cruisers. I actually thought of it as the next deal option. What I found my interests in the Land Cruiser Series 90 is that the Land Cruiser Series 90 was likely a step up to what Lexus has become in the US since 25 years ago, or likely 30. It's a bit complicated when you think about it, but when people understand what the Land Cruiser was named as a Lexus in the US, people just say that is not actually a Lexus. That's just a rebadged version of a Toyota vehicle that looks like a Lexus, but it was obviously a Toyota based product. I think what Toyota understands about manufacturing cars is that they became the number one brand all over the world, including the UK, Australia, Dubai, the UAE, and a bunch of other places too. Pretty much Toyota technically follows other known brands at the time, like Mitsubishi with the Montero, Nissan did with the Safari Patrol, Jeep done it with the Jeep Wrangler, Land Rover did it with the Range Rover and the Defender, I guess. But what beats them all to the number one place is the Toyota Land Cruiser because it was more reliable. What I learned from owning a Land Cruiser from an older age and an older time was likely the very thing that started my career as a car enthusiast. Hope you guys enjoy watching this video. Make sure that you go comment, like, and subscribe.